Good evening, I'm Dr. Martin Farr, co-chair of the Public Lectures Committee. Welcome to the latest Insights virtual lecture and to tonight's British Academy lecture for a reparatory social science by Professor Gurminder K. Bambra, University of Sussex. Delivered by the most outstanding academics in the UK and beyond, the British Academy's flagship lecture programme showcases the very best scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. This is the first time that the British Academy have held its flagship series of lectures outside of London, and we are delighted to have been selected as a host. I'll be back after the lecture for a live Q&A with the speaker. If you'd like to submit a question, you may do so via the YouTube live chat box on your screen or via Twitter @InsightsNCL. If you're tweeting about the event and want to share your thoughts, please use #InsightsNCL. Our speaker. Gurminder K. Bambra is Professor of Postcolonial and Decolonial Studies in the Department of International Relations and the Director of Research and Knowledge Exchange in the School of Global Studies, University of Sussex. She is a Fellow of the British Academy, elected in 2020, and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, elected in 2021. She is President of the British Sociological Association and has recently won a major Leverhulme Trust Major Research Fellowship to work on a project entitled Varieties of Colonialism. Among her publications are Rethinking Modernity, Postcolonialism and the Sociological Imagination, which won the 2008 BSA's Philip Abrams Memorial Prize for Best First Book. Connected Sociologies, and most recently in 2021, the co-authored book, Colonialism and the Modern Social Theory, which maintained that addressing colonial histories is a necessary preliminary to the reconstruction of social theory. She is series editor of the Theory for a Global Age series, and in 2015 set up the Global Social Theory website to support students and academics interested in social theory in global perspective. Her current projects focus on epistemological justice and reparations and on the political economy of race and colonialism. In tonight's British Academy lecture for a reparatory social science, Professor Bambra will argue for the need to account for colonial histories as central to the construction of the nation and to the social structures through which inequalities are legitimated and reproduced, and puts forward a framework for the reparatory social science, one that is oriented to global justice as a reconstructed project of the present. I hope you enjoy the lecture.
Many thanks for the invitation to deliver this lecture. I'm delighted to be able to do so, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards. The continuing coronavirus pandemic has combined with other global crises to highlight some of the fundamental challenges of social inequality that currently face us. These include the differing consequences of the pandemic within countries, as well as the disparities in vaccine rollout between countries, politically organised hostility towards migrants and minorities, and the escalation of violence and instability that produces refugees, the elite capture of an ever-increasing share of global wealth, alongside a global increase in poverty and destitution. To these can be added the interconnections between growth and depletion that are at the heart of environmental degradation and climate catastrophe, both imminent and historical. The inequalities that are inscribed in these different examples are not specific to countries or to particular situations. They transcend borders and limits. They're global, both in their current configuration and their historical constitution. Similarly, any solutions to the challenges represented will be global. Considerations of the global within the social sciences tend to be developed from understandings of the modern, and the two terms are often seen as interchangeable. Within such understandings, the global is seen as the space into which modern social and political developments have expanded. That is, it's understood as constituted through the political relations between modern nation states, or as coming into being through the global dissemination of capitalist developments out from national economies. Empire and colonial relationships more generally disappear in such accounts, reappearing, if at all, as contingent phenomena which are deemed to lie in a receding past. In contrast, I argue for the need to address the political relations of extraction that bound colonies to national metropoles and which, in the process, defined colonial global economies that service national projects in the West. It is only by acknowledging the significance of the colonial global that it will be possible to understand and address the necessarily post-colonial present that is the context for the issues of inequality set out above. To the extent that the global is approached only as a phenomenon of recent salience, as in the work of Ulrich Beck, for example, the reconstruction of the social sciences that many scholars call for in the turn to the global is only to be applied to future endeavours. They maintain the adequacy of past interpretations and conceptual understandings. In contrast, I argue for the need to rethink the histories upon which the social sciences themselves are based, as well as an opening up of future possibilities on the basis of such rethinking. In the talk, then, I first set out the limitations of taking the nation as the standard unit of analysis, and I argue for the need to consider our colonial past as the basis for thinking about contemporary configurations of the global. This is followed by a discussion of the implications of these arguments for how we understand citizenship and belonging in the present. The nation state is a primary unit of analysis across the social sciences. It is understood to organize the formal international division of the world as well as social relations domestically. Within social structural sciences, like sociology, the emergence of the nation state is associated with modernity, and in the process, it is seen to displace empires, which are associated with earlier historical periods, as Eisenstadt has set out. This standard account presents nations and empires as distinct political units. While scholars often accept that a number of European states extended their powers beyond national boundaries through colonial activities, that is, by establishing empires, recognition of this coextensive and overlapping activity rarely calls into question their categorization as analytically distinct. This has implications for the study of global inequality, among other topics, of all national inequalities. And yet, the political entities they discuss were rarely nations over the longue durée. Rather, they were imperial formations constituted by a colonizing state and colonial territories and populations that were asymmetrically incorporated. This asymmetry involved the extraction of wealth, of labor, resources, and taxation from the colonies, which was appropriated by the colonizing state and used to its benefit. As such, it makes little sense to compare the economies of Britain and India over the past 2 centuries, which both authors do, when for 200 years prior to 1947, the wealth of India was largely siphoned off to the benefit of the British economy and social institutions more generally, and to the detriment of the Indian population. What was true of Britain was also true of other European colonial powers, as scholars such as Eduardo Galeano, Walter Rodney, Samir Amin, among many others, have set out. Neither Milanovic nor Piketty is unaware of Europe's long history of colonization. It's just that colonial processes are not regarded by them as significant to the shaping of global inequalities. This is in part because, along with many other social scientists, they posit a novel post-colonial state, perceived as fragile and at risk of failing, in contrast to the modern European nation state, but without addressing the processes of colonization that were themselves part of state formation for both colony and colonizer. If colonization was taken seriously, then the modern nation state would only be seen to emerge in the period of decolonization, as previous states would more appropriately be understood as imperial or colonial states. In their conceptualization, however, Milanovic and Piketty follow a standard understanding of the emergence of the nation state, which associates it with the system of sovereign states that came into being in Europe in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia. This representation of the process suggests that after Westphalia, the modern nation state was initially shaped by the North American and French revolutions of the late 18th century, and then within Europe, there were 2 routes to modern statehood. The first was the evolution of nation states within the boundaries of existing territorial states, as was the case of most European, North and Western European countries. And the second route established a nation and then a state, as exemplified by the ethno-national projects of Germany and Italy in the late 19th century. These initial formations are said to have been followed by the establishment of post-colonial states in the period of mass decolonization in the mid to late 20th century. Such an account is standard across the social sciences, but it's an odd illusion that posits a post-colonial state without addressing the processes of colonization as part of the process of state formation. The way in which the state is defined, in terms of its contemporary boundaries and historical constitution, is central to the shaping of politics in the present, including the politics of citizenship. It defines who belongs, and perhaps more importantly, who has the right to belong. Correlatively, it also defines who has the right to move, and who has the right to move with rights, an increasingly important political question that confronts us in a variety of locations. Most discussions of modern citizenship are framed in terms of political inclusion within or exclusion from nation states. Such discussions rarely discuss the significance of colonial relations. Rogers Brubaker's classic account of the construction of citizenship, for example, revolves around a consideration of its emergence in France and Germany. France is presented as the originary modern nation state, where conceptions of nationhood and citizenship cohere around political unity, and which continue to bear the mark of their origin in the 1789 political revolution. The unification of Germany a century later, in 1871, is seen to give rise to a form of political unity that is understood as derivative of ethnic and cultural unity. In each case, empire is missing from the discussion of the relevant political community. In this section now, I focus on the French case to ask what happens to understandings of citizenship when we put consideration of empire back into the discussion. In France, the Code Noir was established in the late 17th century, and it regulated the lives of the enslaved in the French Caribbean. It subsequently also covered the conditions governing the lives of those who migrated from the colonies to the French national state. As Tyler Stovall argues, it was one of the first major examples of the conflict between political and legal equality on the one hand, and racial discrimination and domination on the other. This is the case within the French state, where the French state here is understood to include its colonial territories. Beyond the Code Noir, there were also many debates during the revolutionary period in France over whether Black men could be citizens or whether colour itself was a bar to civic and political equality. Ultimately, it was the failure to transcend racial categories that had white French citizens deny the claim for participation and representation that was being made by Black appellants. As such, this suggests that ideas of equality, political participation, and membership in their dominant French articulation were and continue to be limited by race. This is different from how the exclusions of gender and class are resolved in the extension of the suffrage, precisely because of the colonial construction of racial exclusion. The Code Noir constructed full citizens as white, and others as outside of citizenship. This finds its way unreflectively into contemporary scholarship, such that the struggle against domination comes to be represented as inconsistent with the form of modern citizenship. Worse, racial struggles often come to be seen as a threat to the very idea of equality. Pierre Rasson-Vallon, for example, is not unusual among scholars in working with a conception of the French nation that sees its population historically as constituted solely in terms of its white citizens. In his 2013 book, Society of Equals, he argues that the revolutionary spirit of equality expressed during the French Revolution shaped particular understandings of citizenship organized around a commitment to shared values. However, he suggests that such understandings are no longer adequate to address the challenges we face in our contemporary era. What is needed instead is a revised understanding of equality that starts from an acknowledgement of the many ways in which we, as individuals, are different, rather than by way of what we might share. Indeed, one of the poisons of equality for Rossum-Valon is separatism, that is, group identity in all its varieties. This is the basis from which he argues that the solidarities of immigrant communities today are in breach of the foundational equality of citizenship within the French nation. This is notwithstanding that such a society was itself constituted through the exclusion of others on the basis of characteristics ascribed to them as members of groups. Rossum-Valon's failure to locate the French nation within the broader colonial processes of the French state is what enables him to regard all others as external to the nation and as impinging problematically upon the foundational equality of its citizenship. Not only does Rossum-Valon fail to engage with the French colony of Haiti, which was central to these debates, or to Algeria subsequently, but he also fails to examine the various debates on citizenship and equality that were taking place in Paris itself during the revolutionary period. As David Geggus has argued, there were many debates during this period over whether Black men could be citizens or whether colour itself was a radical obstacle to civic and political equality. In 1791, for example, it was proposed that only non-whites born of free parents, not freed men, should be accorded political equality. This limited decree was passed in May of that year, but it was then overturned a couple of months later. Events in Saint-Domingue, which was to become Haiti after the revolution, intensified over the summer as a consequence of this rollback. And as Geggus states, the largest revolt of enslaved peoples in the history of the Americas ensued. This put further pressure on French legislators to concede full racial equality, which they did in 1792, and eventually emancipation for those who'd been enslaved, which was achieved in 1794. While these achievements were tremendous, they were not long-lasting. Slavery was re-established within the French Empire by Napoleon in 1802, and citizenship reconfirmed as the preserve of white men with property. Nonetheless, the contestations are significant, and they point to more complex histories of citizenship and equality than those presented by Rossum-Valon and others. The failure to transcend racial categories or their own group identity as white is a long-standing feature of European scholarship. This is compounded by the insistence that race only enters Europe and European debates in the post-Second World War period. The repercussions of such understandings in the present are profound and can be seen to be part of the current impasse of democratic politics in France and elsewhere. It is the failure to recognize the colonial relations that shape the political possibilities of the French national project that enables scholars such as Rossum-Valon to normalize the group identity of the nation, conceived in homogeneous terms, and to pathologize the group identities of multicultural immigrants and diverse others. If the political community of France had been extended to include also the colonial possessions of France, then different understandings of equality and citizenship may have been possible. This is not a situation specific to France, but is the common condition of many European nations and the European project more broadly. Europe did not become multicultural in the post-Second World War period. It was empirically multicultural from the time various European countries began the process of incorporating territories and populations into the ambit of their states and settling the territories of others with their own populations. To say that they were incorporated is precisely not to say that they were included, that is, treated as equals. Incorporation points to the hierarchical relations of domination that characterize colonization and come to be reproduced within national polities that fail to account for their colonial histories. As Homewood argues, European societies have had no difficulty in multiculturalism within a hierarchy of domination. The only problem they have, or seem to have, is with multicultural equality. The end of colonialism and empire, then, did not bring an end to the legacies of its social structures. The patterns of inequality shaping the world are consequent to those legacies, and they need to be understood within a connected frame of reference. This leads me to my concluding thoughts on what a reparatory social science that is explicitly oriented to an address of these issues might look like. The question of reparations has gained increasing salience in recent years, with Hilary Beckles and Shashi Tharoor, amongst others, arguing variously for reparations for Caribbean slavery, the dispossession and elimination of indigenous populations, and colonial drain from the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere. They follow a number of scholars and activists who, understanding the relationship between colonialism and modernity, question the naturalization within the social sciences of the poverty and inequality produced by European expansion. Walter Rodney's classic text, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, or the earlier contributions of Dadabhai Naoroji, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, and Lala Lajpat Rai's England's Debt to India, demonstrate the connections between the wealth of Europe and poverty elsewhere as historically produced through colonial processes. These connections have been elided in standard social scientific accounts, which have focused primarily on the nation and an understanding of social science predicated on the difference of and between nations. Once we accept that the global interconnections that brought the world into being as a global entity were colonial, then we need to understand modernity itself as colonial modernity. This means that there's less an issue of completing modernity, as Habermas might argue, and more one of decolonizing it, as Nelson Maldonado Torres has argued. This involves addressing the global inequalities established through colonialism, as well as rethinking how we understand those inequalities within social science disciplines. This would include examining the self-understanding of the social sciences, especially in terms of issues of social justice and redistribution. As I've argued elsewhere, arguments about welfare entitlements in the present often revolve around questions of belonging and legitimacy. These tend to be framed in terms of the nation and of being able to demonstrate historical belonging to the nation. However, as European nations have histories that go far beyond the national form, then such questions need to be rethought in terms of those broader connections. That is, the patrimony of European states has never been simply national. It has been established on the basis of colonial histories. As such, distribution of that patrimony ought not to be limited by the nation. Rethinking the nation enables us to rethink citizenship, which in turn enables us to rethink how we might address the various challenges that face us. A reparatory social science requires both the repair of the social sciences epistemologically, as well as being invested in the collective address of the inequalities implicitly and sometimes explicitly legitimated by standard social science. It requires us to rethink our disciplines by taking modern empire as the unit of analysis, rather than the modern nation. It further requires us to recognize that what we understand as the modern world is actually the colonial global world. Taken together, these understandings would enable us to more adequately contextualize events and processes that are often presented as separate, and to understand them within a connected frame of reference, one committed to repair and transformation. Recognizing that the entities we understand as nations were actually implicated in a colonial global project enables us to acknowledge different connections between histories and processes that we otherwise thought of as separate. It enables us to consider the relationship between wealth here and poverty over there, and to address this inequality within the common frame of national and global redistribution, rather than the more usual considerations of aid or charity or development. Further, as Mahmoud Mamdani has recently argued, acknowledging our colonial connections historically opens up the possibility of more expansive and generous policies regarding citizenship and membership within political communities in the present. What is needed is a reconstructive post-colonial vision that acknowledges the connected histories that have produced the present, and which seeks to address those inequalities through a commitment to global redistributive justice. A reparatory social science, I argue, provides the space for all of us to be invested in a project to make a world that works for us all. Thank you.
And we're here live with our speaker. Govinda, thank you so much. Welcome to Insights.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Since you recorded your talk, of course, we've had the crisis in Ukraine has taken place. And we're here live with our speaker. Govinda, thank you so much. Welcome to Insights. How this impacts on the things you were discussing in your talk and how this may affect your current project.
Yes, I mean, it's been terrible watching what's transpired over the last week or so. And in terms of the work that I have done and am doing, much of that work really focuses on European empires outside of Europe. And I guess what recent events have really highlighted with such force is that, well, there were also empires within Europe, notably the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and obviously the Russian Empire, including possibly a Soviet empire. And I think what this is pointing to is the need to bring these within a common framework of understanding. So while the breakup of the Russian Empire was initially managed, I guess, in terms of the establishment of the Soviet Union with its people's republics and so on, its eventual dissolution in the late 20th century created or then reasserted a variety of nationality claims that are similar to those from the breakup of earlier empires. So one of the things that I think has been demonstrated that's important to us as social scientists is that it really opens up questions of empire, nationalism, and minority rights in ways that perhaps haven't been explicitly addressed as issues of Europe and within Europe. And so in this sense, whilst we have talked about the place of minorities, for example, of Jewish people or of Roma people, or of minorities whose position is a consequence of the breakup of internal European empires, or of minorities then who moved to Europe from European empires externally, we've often thought about these as separate issues, each with their own history. But what if they were all connected by a framework that requires us to address empire, nationalism, and minority rights together? And so, as I argued in the talk, I think what this would do is challenge the methodological priority that we give to the nation within the social sciences and further demonstrate its fictional character. And then this work, in terms of thinking about the ways in which internal European empires also need to be brought into this frame of thinking is something that I haven't worked on as yet, but it's looking ever more urgent as something that we do need to take into consideration.
It's been quite striking the extent to which the Russian government, I watched Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister's press conference today, how much they're using Western imperialism, throwing it back in the face of criticism of what's taking place in Ukraine.
As a sort of justification
Yeah.
for other actions in the present. I know, I mean, and I think one of the things that perhaps we haven't taken account of fully is the extent to which what we do is seen globally. And is seen by people and interpreted through the frameworks that are present in those places. So we mustn't imagine that when we talk about enlightenment or liberalism or progress, that those places where those values are not enacted, even though they might be used as the cloak for other sorts of actions, that people don't realize what else is going on and understand these sorts of double standards that are present. I mean, one of the ways in which we see it perhaps most explicitly at the moment, I mean, I mentioned in the talk about, you know, the difference between people who can move and those who can move with rights. And one of the things that we're seeing at the Ukrainian border with EU countries is who is being able to cross that border with rights and who is being able to cross that border if they're able to cross that border, but then immediately subject to surveillance and being moved out of the EU immediately and so on. So I think these sorts of things don't go unnoticed and have to be taken seriously.
I mean, the Ukraine war is an event beyond our experience, our living experience. How often do you find that major events, ongoing events, affect your research and your work?
Well, the crisis for refugees that occurred in 2015 as a consequence of the war in Syria, I think, was the last big event that happened that really brought me to sort of question this idea of citizenship, of refugees, of this idea of who owes what to whom and why. And then that was also going on alongside the referendum on our sort of leaving the EU. And that was also bringing up questions of citizenship and belonging in particular sorts of ways. And so both of those processes absolutely shaped my research agenda. You know, I wrote on Brexit, I wrote on refugees, I thought about what it means to have a commitment to cosmopolitan Europe, but to refuse the valuing of difference within Europe, you know, to the extent that there's an explicit, Cameron and Merkel and Sarkozy talked about the death of multiculturalism at the same time as presenting an argument for cosmopolitan Europe. So what's the distinction between multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism except race? And that becomes the unspoken within that sort of dynamic. So I think it's important, you know, so these things, these events bring to the fore truths that are hidden or perhaps out of view, and suddenly they're there, often on our screens every day, and we're forced to confront the difference between what we say we believe in and the values we hold, and then the reality of how we act in the world. And it's that discrepancy that I think we're also seeing a little bit at the moment.
Have you found, as many people engaged in scholarship and writing and commentating found that the combination of the Brexit referendum and 2020 have increased public interest and your opportunities for public engagement with your research? Is that something which has come across in the last year or so?
I mean, I hope so. I mean, I've certainly spoken in many more venues outside of the university around these sorts of themes, so art galleries and public events and engaging in festivals and so on, because these things, they throw up the possibility of sort of thinking about these things more explicitly, and also this idea of who belongs, who gets to belong and claim citizenship and claim belonging and so on. And these are questions that we can all have an opinion on, but there are also histories that make some opinions that substantiate some opinions and contradict other opinions. And I think it's important to bring that sense of what is the evidence on the basis of which we're claiming to know about certain things. So I think it's really important to have that sense of a commitment to scholarship and a rigorous sense of standards that adjudicate between differing points of views on the basis of historical facts.
How significant do you think the summer of 2020 was in this respect, with the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter protests and the reconsideration across public life?
I mean, I think it was significant to the extent that, again, it was this sort of an explosion of interest in these issues and a bringing to awareness of how these processes structure our lives, structure society more generally, and so on. And a sense that it wasn't really possible just to turn away from that. One had to engage with it, one had to think about it. And hopefully some of the changes in thinking that were brought about as a consequence of the sense of shock that people have in seeing these sorts of images will go on to have other sorts of considerations. But we've had that also with the Sarah Everard murder, whose anniversary is today. You know, it's been a year. And this sense of violence against women and the way in which, you know, this continues to repeat itself. And so we're shocked at certain moments. But what do we do with that shock? How can we make longer lasting change so that we don't constantly have to deal with the same sorts of issues? So the George Floyd murder is in a long line. You know, you have sort of from Emmett Till during the civil rights period, you've had Trayvon Martin and any number of individuals who've lost their lives at the hands of police enforcement in the US, but similarly also in the UK. We've had similar sorts of issues. And so I think one caution that I would have in relation to looking to the US is that we often exceptionalize what happens there. And that becomes the frame through which we think about issues of race or racial inequality in Britain. But Britain isn't the US. We have a very different history here. And I'm thinking also of the colonial history, which also makes our understanding of race different in the UK, in part because the issues are much more complicated through its colonial histories.
And on which point we have some questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, you can do so via the live chat box on the YouTube page or on Twitter at InsightsNCL as our handle. Our first question comes from Simon, who asks, in what ways do you think that colonialism and slavery continue to shape the world today?
Well, I think to the extent that we understand ourselves as living in the modern world, and the way in which we often think about the modern is politically modern or economically modern, and these aspects of modernity are associated with the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. The key argument that I've made is that what we understand as the modern world is not just the modern world, it's the colonial modern world. And so in that sense, it is the processes of colonization and enslavement and indenture that have shaped the way in which the world is configured in the present. And that really has an impact on, you know, on the configuration of inequalities in the present, for example. So all inequalities, I would suggest, that exist within the world today have that historical legacy. And if we're wanting to address the historical legacy, the best way we can do that is by focusing on those inequalities in the present and addressing them.
I think this is quite a good chance for Craig's question, which has just arrived. To what extent does our understanding of international relations in 2022 stem from a total disregard of non-Western history?
Well, there is a sense in which what we understand to be important is what happens within Europe and the West more broadly, and that what happens elsewhere is either not taken into account at all, or seen as insignificant, or seen as simply derivative of what's happening within the West. And so there's this sense that what we don't really understand is the extent of who we are is shaped by our relationships with the rest of the world, that we've created the world in this particular way. And so if we don't understand those connections, we'll understand less about what's going on in the world at the moment. So one of the things, you know, so if we sort of think to the refugee crises or the crisis for refugees that has been going on, one of the things that we often say is, oh, well, you know, why should people who've not contributed to establishing the wealth of Europe just get to come here and participate in taking that wealth, for example, through the welfare system and so on. And yet that completely misrecognizes the extent to which the wealth of Europe has been established on the basis of extractive processes that have drawn wealth from other places through labor, through taxation, and through the appropriation of resources and minerals and so on. So the wealth of Europe is absolutely established on the basis of colonialism. And yet when those who lost out through that encounter now wish to come here and participate in it, that seemed to be illegitimate. And so I think, yes, there's the issue of international relations, but there's also the issue of sort of social science within our own states as well, which always is predicated on the basis of a national history as opposed to an imperial history.
This is a very nice segue into Michelle's question. Michelle asked, we've recently seen movements within Newcastle University and similar institutions to decolonize the curriculum. How does post-colonial theory differ from decolonization?
So I think decolonization, for me at least, always refers to a social and political movement. It's a movement in the world that seeks to dismantle the colonial world that's been established and to create something different in its aftermath. Post-colonial theory emerges in literature departments, humanities departments in the sort of late 1970s, early 1980s. And in a way, it's grappling with the world after colonialism, but with a recognition that there are legacies of colonialism that continue to shape the world. It's much more interested in questions of identity, of difference, of culture, and so on. And one of the things that I've tried to do in my work is to draw on the insights of post-colonial theory, whereby it's opened up questions of how we think about the colonial in our contemporary world, and to bring those questions into the social sciences in order to think more deeply about the ways in which colonialism has constructed the world within which we live, not simply in cultural terms, but for me, I'm more interested in it in structural terms. And then how do we grapple with that? So I think there's a theoretical, or I guess what I would say is that for me, I use the term post-colonial in order to remind myself to always think about the colonial in what it is that I'm talking about.
In terms of the structural, we have a question from Julio. Does our understanding of colonial relations also shape how we understand or view class?
I mean, I think it absolutely should, but the difficulty is that it often doesn't. And we think of class as a national category that emerges in terms of thinking about the socioeconomic relations within the nation, and not thinking about how the space of empire actually created the possibility of different forms of socioeconomic inequality across that space. So to give you one example of this, when the British Empire included India, it established income tax on colonial subjects in India. And this income tax was established in 1860. And at that time, the working class and middle classes within Britain, within England specifically, didn't have to pay any income tax. And they didn't pay it until about towards the end of the First World War. And yet colonial subjects were paying income tax. That income tax came to Westminster, but it was never redistributed back to them through any form of welfare, not even when there were catastrophic famines caused by colonial policy and people were dying in their hundreds of thousands. The government refused to redistribute any of that money to them, despite them being, to use that terminology, taxpayers. So they were taxpayers, but not citizens. And in being taxpayers, you could say that they ought to have had a claim on the money that they were giving to the government, but they didn't, because colonialism had them separated. And yet that tax was used to provide welfare benefits for the working class and the poor within Britain. So what does that say about class in Britain versus just the general category of colonial subjects in India? How could we bring all of that into a common frame to think And that would require us to rethink what we understand class to be.
Our penultimate question comes from Faye, who refers back to Craig's question about having ignored non-Western history. Faye asks, so what steps do we need to take to share or teach colonial and overlooked histories?
I think one thing that I would say is that these aren't just non-Western histories, these are also Western histories, because these are the histories, what the West did in other places, but it refuses to acknowledge. So the extent to which we don't know very much about what Britain did in India or other parts of its empire isn't just of concern to those who are in those other parts of the world or from those other parts of the world, but should also be of concern to people within Britain. I mean, our welfare state was established in part through the taxes of colonial subjects, and yet there is no scholar of the welfare state who incorporates an understanding of the way in which colonial taxes contributed to the development of the welfare state and what that might mean for questions of legitimacy in the present. And so I think it's important for us to think about this also as British history and to recognize that British history was global. And so if we only know about British history in Britain, then we really don't have an adequate sense of ourselves as a consequence.
I know of no such research, you're quite right. I've left this last question till the end because it's a very broad one. I thought quite a nice way to end the conversation. It's from Elizabeth, and she asks, in your opinion, what is the future of post-colonial studies?
Well, I hope it's a future in which one doesn't need post-colonial studies. And the reason I say that is because I've also used, so I'm a feminist. I believe that it's important for there to be gender equality. I don't wish to be a feminist. I'm a feminist as a political position. I wish to live in a world beyond the need to be a feminist. Similarly with post-colonial studies, for the moment, it's an incredibly important tool for us to remember colonialism in the context of the way in which we think about the world. The reason it's necessary is because we don't think about colonialism in the construction of the world. Once we've begun to take that into account and begun to develop our concepts and categories on the basis of a consideration of the world as it came to be, then hopefully there wouldn't be the need, and we address the inequalities that colonialism has established, then hopefully there wouldn't be the need for post-colonial studies.
The perfect conclusion to a very stimulating evening. Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. Thank you to our speaker, Professor Gurminder K. Bambra, and to the British Academy. And thank you very much for watching. Our next event will be on Tuesday, the 8th of March, and it will be our annual Sophia lecture, The Role of Place in Recovering from the Crisis. What have universities got to do with it? By Dame Julia Unwin. We hope you can join us then.